You know, when you picture a machine breaking down, you usually envision something, well, really obvious.
Right, like a blown tire on the highway or such.
Exactly. A blown tire or maybe a shattered screen on your phone. The damage is immediate, and you can see the consequence right there in front of you.
Yeah, the impact is entirely contained.
It's
It is
a
just you, the car, and the side of the road.
But then, you look at something like the modern American food supply. We don't usually treat what's on our dinner plate like it came from a machine, but it absolutely did.
Without a doubt.
And today, we are popping the hood on that machine to understand the gears, the wiring, and the leverage behind everything you eat. Because we have pulled together a massive stack of sources for you today: historical agricultural data, USDA reports, supply chain analyses.
Industry histories, yeah.
Right. All to trace how we went from millions of local butchers and backyard gardens to a highly engineered system where just a handful of giant plants feed the entire country. And we're doing a deep dive into all of it.
We really are. I mean, we
Yeah.
were tracking about 150 years of intense industrialization and consolidation here.
Yeah.
And the core paradox we found woven through all of this research is that efficiency and vulnerability are two sides of the same coin.
That's the crazy part.
It is. Over a century and a half, we built a food system of astonishing, almost unimaginable productivity. But in the relentless pursuit of making food perfectly efficient and incredibly cheap, we completely reshaped the architecture of risk.
It kind of makes me think of an incredibly complex, ultra-high-speed train.
Okay, I like that.
Like, it gets you from point A to point B faster and cheaper than ever before in human history.
Yeah.
But if that train jumps the tracks, the wreckage is spectacular.
Yeah.
You aren't dealing with a localized flat tire anymore,
Mhm.
You were dealing with a massive, cascading, systemic crash.
Exactly. And to understand how we built a system capable of those systemic crashes, you really have to look at the very foundation of modern food. The entire story begins with essentially a war against distance in the late 19th century.
Which is wild to think about, because before the 1870s, the geometry of the American diet was strictly local.
Highly localized, yeah.
If you wanted a steak, you essentially had to be living near a cow. Food was grown, it was butchered, and it was eaten within a very tight geographic radius.
Right.
If a rancher wanted to sell Midwestern beef to the East Coast, they literally had to load a live animal onto a train and ship it to New York or Boston to be slaughtered locally. I mean, you are paying to transport the bones, the hide, the hooves.
And hoping the animal survives the trip.
that.
And the logistics of moving live animals like that created a hard economic ceiling on how much meat could be sold and how cheaply it could be priced.
Mm.
But the paradigm shifted completely around 1878 to 1880 thanks to a businessman named Gustavus Swift.
And an engineer, right, Andrew Chase.
Yes, Andrew Chase. They essentially cracked the code on insulated, refrigerated rail cars. These were cooled by ice loaded into the roof.
Ah, the top-iced cars.
Exactly, the top ice cars. And this completely severed the connection between where an animal was raised and where it was consumed.
Wow.
Because now you could slaughter cattle in Chicago, chill what they called the dressed beef, and ship only the profitable edible meat across the continent.
That's so much more efficient.
Huge efficiency upgrade. Swift engineered a massive rolling cold chain. He set up ice stations along the rail lines to keep the cars chilled. And by 1920, his company was operating a fleet of about 7,000 of these refrigerated cars.
7,000 cars.
Yeah, it was a massive operation.
And the epicenter of this rolling cold chain was the Chicago Union Stockyards, which opened a bit earlier, I think in 1865.
Yep, 1865.
The sources paint this picture of a place that wasn't just a holding pen, it was an industrial laboratory. This is the birthplace of the disassembly line.
Yes, a crucial concept here.
Because instead of a skilled local butcher carefully breaking down an entire animal, which, takes years of training and hours of labor, they
Right.
shattered the process into fragments.
They completely inverted the entire logic of butchery. Animal carcasses moved continuously on overhead trolleys, and as the carcass traveled down the line, it passed a series of stationary workers.
Right.
Each worker made one highly specific cut, repeating that single motion for their entire shift.
It's like reverse engineering a Lego set at industrial speed.
That's a great way to picture it.
But the genius and, frankly, the ruthlessness of this system was the de-skilling of the worker.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, if you want to build a massive Lego castle from scratch, you need to be a master builder. You need to know how the whole thing fits together.
Right, you need expertise.
But if your only job is standing by a conveyor belt pulling off one specific blue block every 3 seconds for 12 hours a day, you require absolutely zero training.
Zero. which fundamentally shifted the balance of power from labor to capital. Swift and the other massive meat packers could hire totally unskilled workers, pay them next to nothing, and replace them instantly if they quit or were injured.
Wow.
It drastically lowered the cost of production. And it is a profound historical footnote that this hyper-efficient food disassembly line directly inspired Henry Ford.
Oh, really?
Yeah, when he was designing the automobile assembly line decades later, food industrialized first. And at its absolute peak, the Chicago setup was supplying over 80% of the nation's meat.
80%. So they are trading the resilience of 1,000 independent local butchers for centralized, extreme efficiency.
Exactly.
And once Wall Street and these massive corporations realized distance didn't matter for beef, they immediately applied that exact same financial blueprint to the rest of the grocery store.
They did. The conquest of distance in meat proved that national supply chains were possible. It paved the way for the standardization of everything else.
So we see industrial canning step in, taking highly seasonal, highly perishable produce and transforming it into a shippable, shelf-stable commodity.
Right, but the ultimate proof of concept happened in the baking aisle.
Oh, yes. Nabisco.
Yeah, in 1898 and 1899, Nabisco launches the Oneida biscuit. That's U-N-E-D-A.
Catchy.
Very.
Yeah.
And the product itself was just a standard cracker, but the innovation was the packaging. It came in a sealed, moisture-proof box.
And armed with the first $1 million national advertising campaign, right?
Yep. And riding those exact same rail networks, Swift helped pioneer. Nabisco was selling around 10 million packages a month within just 2 years.
10 million a month. That is an astronomical figure for the turn of the century.
It really is. The Oneida biscuit fundamentally shifted consumer psychology. It effectively killed the local open Cracker Barrel at the general store.
Which in turn started pushing the local miller and baker out of business.
Exactly. The corporate logic was just irresistible. I mean, why buy a potentially stale cracker out of a wooden barrel from the guy down the street when you can buy a perfectly crisp, nationally branded biscuit shipped from a massive, spotless factory?
Okay, but wait. I want to push back on this narrative of corporate takeover for a second.
Sure.
If I'm living in 1899, I am absolutely buying the Oneida biscuit. A factory-sealed, moisture-proof package rolling off an automated line genuinely has to be safer and more sanitary than a local open barrel that every single person in town is sticking their unwashed hands into.
Oh, without a doubt.
I mean, standardization had to be a massive upgrade for public health in the short term, right?
You're completely right. That is the exact reason these products succeeded so quickly.
Yeah.
The open Cracker Barrel was notorious for going stale, attracting pests, and spreading local germs.
Yeah, gross.
The factory-sealed box solved the immediate hygiene problem. But this is the crucial pivot in our deep dive today. That same national distribution network laid the groundwork for a completely new vector of risk.
Okay, so you eliminate the localized risk of a dirty Cracker Barrel, but you build a machine capable of shipping a single factory-level error from coast to coast in 3 days.
Precisely. You trade frequent, small, local risks for rare, massive national risks.
The high-speed train just gets faster.
The scale of consequence changes entirely.
Yeah.
When food production centralizes, contamination ceases to be a neighborhood problem and becomes a systemic cross-country vulnerability.
So the centralized machine is speeding up. We have Chicago meat, nationally branded crackers, canned goods traveling thousands of miles. But before this system completely monopolized the American diet, there was one massive temporary reversal back to decentralized food, wasn't there?
Yes.
The era of the victory gardens.
Right, driven entirely by the pressures of global conflict. During World War I, and then to an astonishing degree during World War II, the U.S. government recognized that the industrial food supply needed to be diverted to the military and our allies overseas.
Makes sense.
So they actively urged citizens to grow their own food at home to ease the burden on the commercial supply chain.
And people really stepped up. Between 1941 and 1945, roughly 18 to 20 million victory gardens sprang up across the entire country.
It was massive.
We are talking backyards, vacant lots, rooftops in major cities, whole neighborhoods coordinating to share tools and seeds.
The output data from this period is just remarkable, though we must carefully bound the statistics based on the USDA-derived wartime estimates.
Right, what are the real numbers?
Well, these gardens produced roughly 40% of the nation's fresh vegetables in 1943 and 1944.
40%.
Now, estimates generally range from about a third to the mid-40s, and we really must emphasize that this applies strictly to fresh vegetables. It's not the entire caloric intake of the country.
Right. Right.
But even with those caveats, having tens of millions of everyday people growing nearly half of their fresh produce locally is a staggering feat of decentralized production.
Which makes me wonder about our modern capability, like if we could pull off that level of localized, decentralized production in the 1940s, could a modern American suburb ever feed itself like that today? Or did the rise of the supermarket fundamentally break our muscle memory for growing our own food?
Well, the post-war collapse of local food independence wasn't just a loss of muscle memory. It was the total dismantling of local agricultural infrastructure.
What do you mean?
After 1945, the Victory Gardens vanished almost overnight. They were literally paved over by rapid suburban expansion.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the mega supermarket became the new center of gravity, and it was flooded with those cheap processed and frozen foods. We didn't just forget how to grow a tomato. We lost the localized networks of seeds, the local tool suppliers, and the generational knowledge sharing that made those gardens possible.
We just traded it all for convenience.
Yeah.
And once that decentralized buffer faded away, the path was cleared for the ultimate consolidation of the food supply, which leads us directly to the precarious system we rely on and are completely at the mercy of today.
The sheer scale of the consolidation we found in the data is sobering. Let's look at the farms first.
Okay.
In 1935, American farming hit a peak of about 6.8 million farms. Fast forward to 2024, and we are down to roughly 1.88 million.
We lost 5 million farms.
5 million farms vanished, yet we are producing vastly more food.
How does that even work?
The mechanisms behind that collapse were largely driven by post-World War II economic pressures. The machinery required to farm at an industrial scale, massive tractors, chemical fertilizers, advanced irrigation, it all became incredibly expensive.
Right.
Small farmers simply couldn't afford the capital investment to keep up with the plunging price of commodities. Government policy effectively became get big or get out.
Wow.
So the farms that survived absorbed the ones that failed, shifting from diversified agriculture to massive, highly industrialized monocultures.
But the real bottleneck happens slightly further down the line, right? In the processing phase. We talked about Gustavus Swift in the 1880s creating a meat-packing empire. Today, that empire has consolidated into what the industry calls the big four meat packers.
That's Tyson, JDS, Cargill, and National Beef.
Right.
And depending on the methodology, whether you're analyzing federal data or academic market studies, these four corporate entities now control roughly 80 to 85% of the entire beef market.
That's wild.
Some models place it tightly between 77 and 85%, but either way, it's a massive concentration.
Controlling the financial market is one level of power, but the physical reality of how that meat is processed is the part that actually terrifies me. Our research highlighted a statistic that feels almost impossible to believe. Just 19 cattle plants. 19 individual buildings perform about 80% of all U.S. beef slaughter.
It's true.
And for pork, a couple dozen hog plants do the exact same thing.
And the produce sector mirrors this concentration perfectly. If you are eating a salad in the United States, there is a massive probability it came from one of just two highly specific regions.
Right, depending on the season.
Exactly. During the summer, the vast majority of the nation's leafy greens are sourced from the Salinas Valley in California. In the winter, production shifts almost entirely to Yuma, Arizona.
So we have built a system entirely dependent on what we can call choke points.
Yes, choke points.
To use an internet analogy, it is like having just two massive Wi-Fi routers powering the entire United States. When they are plugged in, the internet is unbelievably fast, cheap, and accessible to everyone. But the architecture of that network means if a single wire frays or someone unplugs one of those two routers, half the country doesn't just experience a slowdown, they go completely dark. The failure cascades across the entire system.
That's exactly it. But we have to remember, the choke points themselves aren't the result of some malicious conspiracy. They exist because of extreme economic optimization.
Make it make sense. Why build it this way?
19 cattle plants allow for incredible economies of scale, keeping meat prices artificially low at the checkout counter. And from a regulatory standpoint, it is vastly easier for the USDA to post inspectors at 19 massive standardized facilities than it is to monitor 19,000 tiny local butchers.
Right, you know exactly where the inspector needs to park their car every morning.
Exactly. The core issue isn't that a massive plant makes errors more frequently than a local butcher. The danger lies in the magnification of an error when it inevitably occurs. If a local butcher in 1910 fails to properly clean a knife, maybe a dozen people in one town get sick. If a machine calibration is slightly off at one of those 19 cattle plants today, that contaminated meat doesn't stay local.
No, it goes everywhere.
Gets processed, shipped out, and blended into countless finished products, ground beef, frozen patties, fast food supply chains, landing in dozens of states within days.
The high-speed train derails, taking out 3 zip codes at once. A highly efficient system has absolutely no slack in it.
None. And discussing a theoretical choke point on paper is fascinating history. But recently, we didn't just read about the fragility of the system. We watched it fracture in real time.
Yeah.
We lived through the ultimate stress test.
April 2020. We are in the early, terrifying days of the pandemic, and worker illness forced Smithfield to close a single pork plant in Sioux Falls, South Dakota.
Just one building.
One single building closes, but that one building processed 4 to 5% of all U.S. pork.
The systemic shockwave was instantaneous. Smithfield's CEO publicly warned that the domestic meat supply chain was breaking and grocery stores could not stay stocked.
I remember that.
Across the industry, the metrics from that period are alarming. At the peak of the disruption, daily slaughter capacity across the United States fell by as much as 45%.
Almost half the country's processing capability just vanished overnight.
Well, we must be precise with the metric's peak daily capacity dropped by up to 45%. But if we look at total actual meat production by mid-May, it was running about 40% below the same period the prior year.
Still, that's huge.
Those measures highlight a system in absolute freefall.
Okay, wait, hold on. I get the fragility argument, but aren't we being a little tough on the architecture here?
How so?
Well, 2020 was a black swan event. A global pandemic is literally a once-in-a-century crisis. You cannot engineer a meat plant to anticipate a novel virus. If my roof caves in during a meteor strike, that doesn't mean I built a bad house.
That is the most common defense of the industry structure. But it fundamentally misunderstands what resilience actually means in supply chain engineering.
Okay, explain that.
A truly resilient system can absorb a massive, unforeseen shock without collapsing entirely, precisely because it has redundancies. It has backup nodes and slack built into the network.
Oh, I see.
The pandemic didn't break the food system. The pandemic illuminated the extreme fragility that was already baked into it. When a handful of plant closures nearly empties the nation's meat capacity in a matter of weeks, you aren't dealing with a meteor strike.
Right.
You are dealing with an architectural flaw where the house was built entirely without load-bearing walls.
Wow, let's synthesize this journey for everyone listening. Over the last 150 years, the machinery of our food supply relentlessly traded resilience for extreme efficiency.
Yeah.
We went from millions of local producers to Gustavus Swift's refrigerated rail cars and the de-skilling of the Chicago disassembly line. We gained incredibly cheap food year-round, beautifully standardized and moisture-proof UNITA biscuit boxes.
And we had that one brief, beautiful moment of localized independence with the World War II victory gardens,
Only to pave over them with suburbs and supermarkets.
leaving us with a modern system defined by massive, highly optimized choke points. We have under 2 million farms feeding hundreds of millions of people, processed through bottlenecks so narrow that a single plant closure in South Dakota can threaten the national meat supply.
That high-speed train gets us exactly what we want right up until the moment it jumps the tracks.
Which brings us to a final thought, Freedom All Over. We spent this whole deep dive analyzing the vulnerabilities inside our borders, the 19 cattle plants, the 2 valleys for lettuce.
Right.
But consider the inputs required to keep those domestic choke points running.
What do you mean?
Well, think about it. If the vast majority of our winter leafy greens come from just one place, Yuma, Arizona, how much of our national food security is silently tied to the precarious water levels of the Colorado River?
Oh, man.
We usually think of food contamination as a bacteria problem, but when the system is this concentrated, a regional drought could be just as contagious to the grocery aisle. Our highly efficient machine is deeply dependent on global and environmental nodes we do not even control.
That is a whole other layer of systemic risk to keep you awake tonight. Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive under the hood of the American food machine. Like and subscribe. It really helps the channel reach others.